All right, so today we're going to talk about family influences. And of course, we need to start by defining a family. So, family is a social unit in which adult spouses or partners and their children share economic, social, and emotional rights and responsibilities, and a sense of commitment and identification. So, families are really important because they're the earliest and most sustained source of social contact for kids. They offer the most kind of intense and enduring interpersonal bonds, especially in childhood. We have these shared memories of the past and expectations of the future with our family, and they're really often the standards against which all other relationships are judged. So family structures certainly vary, but all families have similar functions. And an important thing to remember is that the family is a social system. And so what this means is the family influences everyone in it and is also influenced by even the young people in it. So children influence parent behavior, but parent behavior also influences child behaviors. And so what this means is you end up with this very complex network of reciprocal relationships and interactions. It's constantly evolving, and it's affected both by kind of the people within the system as well as outside community and cultural influences. But generally, we see the main function of families as socializing the young. So teaching children to acquire beliefs, values, and behavior that we consider kind of culturally appropriate. So this promotes personal growth, teaches kids knowledge, perpetuates kind of the social order. And so family members influence each other both directly and indirectly. So direct effects are when you have two members and one directly influences the other person. So this is, spouses praising or criticizing each other, parents hugging or spanking children, children clinging or talking back to parents. But there are also indirect effects. This is when the relationships of two members is indirectly influenced by the third. So when the mother modifies the quantity and quality of father-child interaction, which in turn affects the child's behavior. Likewise, if you have a couple where they have low levels of marital conflict, this may lead to more sensitive parenting from the mother, which could be a good thing for the child. So we'll talk about some of these direct effects, but it's always important to remember that the family is a developing system, which means that the individual development within the system is going to change the family interaction. So for example, as toddlers become more autonomous, they're going to require different treatments and expectations, and that's going to change the family system as a whole. And in a good functioning family system, parents have positive relationships with each other. They support their children. Children are cooperative and responsive. In contrast, when a family is dysfunctional, you might have parents with an unhappy marriage. This may spill over into the child. Children exhibiting antisocial behavior. What happens is you see this kind of negative pattern within the system, which makes it very resistant to change. The more adaptable a family can be, the better functioning the system will be. So we're going to talk about kind of different components of the family system, and we're going to start with the couple. So generally, when partners are mutually supportive, they are more involved with their children, their child-rearing practices are more competent, and their relationships with their children are more affectionate and responsive. And in return, children who have parents who are mutually supportive and affectionate of each other are well-adjusted and positive. What happens is when parents are in conflict with each other, they'll lash out, be hostile, and this conflict will have a direct negative effect on their children. And we see children's level of distress increase as the intensity of parents' fights increase. And so if we can get parents, if they need to have conflict, to engage in constructive conflict where they show respect for each other's opinions, express mutual warmth and support, and model effective conflict negotiation strategies, that has been shown to substantially lessen the negative effects on kids. But there are also indirect effects of parental conflict. So, for example, when there are marital difficulties which affect how parents parent, then they'll affect the child's development. If there's parental conflict, it may lead parents to be more angry and intrusive with their children, and in turn, their children may display more anger and aggression. So there's a couple of explanations for how parental conflict influences social development. So we can think kind of from a social learning theory, which is basically that children learn how to interact with people and resolve conflicts by watching their parents. If their parents are using negative interaction strategies and conflicts, kids are going to in turn use those in their own relationships as well. Attachment theory basically argues that exposure to conflict leads to emotional arousal and distress and a sense of emotional insecurity, which contributes to later problems in social interactions. There are also cognitive processes that are associated with this, so the impact of parental conflict really depends on how children understand the conflict and so how much they understand what's going on. It also is influenced by parental mental health. So, for example, parents' depression could mediate the impact of marital distress on the child's depressive symptoms. And there are there's some evidence for the contribution of genetics. So there's a stronger link between marital conflict and adolescent conduct problems in more closely related parents. So if a mom has a very negative, has a lot of parental or marital conflict, and that has a negative impact on her child, that mom's sister's parental conflict will also influence her niece or nephew. But these links between parental conflict and child adjustment are reciprocal and transactional. So it's not just a one-way influence from parents to children. Marital discord predicts child behavior, but child problems and maladaptive behavior can cause marital discord as well. Okay, so in terms of, are there intervention programs to kind of help this? What can we do about these negative effects? There's some evidence that teaching couples about the effects of constructive and destructive marital conflict can help them use more constructive strategies. And parents who participate in group discussions about parenting or marital issues do see significant improvements. Now, we've been talking about this as if the child is already part of the couple system, but it's worth noting that, especially if you start out with a couple with no children, the addition of particularly the new baby, the first baby on a couple system significantly changes the dynamic. So generally with the advent of the first baby, couples shift towards more traditional divisions of labor. We also see a pretty dramatic decrease in marital satisfaction. Normally it declines more markedly for women than men, and it's a pretty quick decline where father satisfaction declines more gradually. But this also varies a lot based on the child. So if you have a child with a difficult temperament, a constantly fussy baby, this is a much bigger strain on the marriage than an easy child. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the parent-child system. Basically, as kids get older, socialization becomes more deliberate on the parents' parts. This increases through the preschool years, and often the parents' socialization goals are about having their children behave politely, get along with other people, be honest, but the specific goals vary from across families and across cultures. But the general idea is that parents often use kind of the basic principles of learning theory to teach their children social rules. They use reinforcement when they explain kind of the social standards that they expect, then praise or punish their children based on whether or not they conform to social rules. Parents also use modeling to demonstrate the behaviors they want kids to adopt. When we think about socialization and really more generally parenting, there's often two kind of dimensions that we look at. Emotional involvement has to do with how much support and affection parents provide, how warm and loving are they, do they smile and praise and encourage their child, or are they kind of cold and rejecting, really quick to criticize or belittle or punish or ignore their children. Generally, we find that kids want to please more loving and affectionate and emotionally involved parents. But the other dimension that we see parents vary on is the level of control. So this is how much kind of regulation and supervision parents have. So on one side, we have those permissive and undemanding parents who kind of let kids do what they want and make their own decisions. On the other side, we have high control, which are very demanding and restrictive. They monitor behavior very closely. With the level of control, it's a little less clear on which is the good option. But ideally, we'd have a happy medium of some of both of these. Another big thing that parents may use to socialize their children, to teach them the acceptable behavior, is physical punishment. Generally, physical punishment is linked to a variety of negative outcomes. Most notably, it seems to increase children's aggression. I've posted an infographic on Moodle that you can take a look at that provides some more detail as to the outcomes of physical punishment. But it's important to note that this depends on kind of the severity and the type and the frequency of physical punishment. We find the most negative outcomes when physical punishment is the predominant disciplinary tactic, and also when the punishment is very severe and driven by anger and out of control. Okay, so if we go back to those two dimensions that we talked about earlier, emotionality and control, we can actually use these in Diana Baumrind used these to kind of develop 4 different types of parenting. So in the upper left quadrant, we have authoritative parents who are warm and responsive. So they're high on emotionality, but they're also high on control. So they're warm and kind, but they're also restrictive and demanding. Those are the authoritative parents. They're controlling, but they're flexible. They give a rationale for limits. They seek their kids' participation in decisions. This seems to have the best outcome. So their kids are cheerful, they're socially responsible, they have good cognitive outcomes. Next, the authoritarian parents are low on emotionality, so they're rejecting and unresponsive, and high on control. So they tend to be very restrictive, but they don't explain why. They use a lot of power assertion. And these tend to have moody and unhappy children who have average or below average social skills. Permissive parents are warm and responsive, but low on control. So they're very accepting, but they're really lax, and they don't really monitor their kids. These kids tend to be impulsive and aggressive and a little more self-centered, and below average on cognitive and social. And finally, the uninvolved parents are rejecting or just unresponsive and also permissive. They're not really noticing their kids. These kids tend to have the worst outcomes in terms of aggression and externalizing outcomes and things like that. Okay, so as I mentioned, Baumrind is really the name that we link with this, and she really linked those parenting styles to children's outcomes. So this is another way of looking at it, but this is the blue and the gray bars tell you how much control and nurturance based on these specific types of children. So energetic children tend to have more control and more nurturance. These kids are more socially competent, and we're more likely to have authoritative parents. Conflicted and irritable children tended to be fearful and moody, and were likely to have authoritarian parents who engage in a lot of control but not a lot of nurturance. And then finally, impulsive and aggressive children tend to be uncontrolled and non-compliant and aggressive. They have a lot of that nurturance, but they have no limits, so they have no control. The uninvolved or disengaged parenting was added a little later on, so it was in that original square, the diagram with the 4 squares. But these parents tend to do whatever is necessary to kind of minimize the costs of having children. They put in kind of as little time and effort as possible. They're kind of indifferent to their children. And what happened is these kids are likely to be aggressive, moody, and kind of non-compliant. Now, often we ask the question, who's driving the effects? So kind of historically, we've made the argument that parenting causes child behavior. But as we've talked about several times in this course, it's also possible that children influence their parents, right? So if you have an easy child, you might be more likely to engage in authoritative parenting because your child's easy to negotiate with. But really, I think the most likely is that we have this transactional model where there's a reciprocal influence. Parents influence their children more than kids influence their parents, but kids affect the parenting too. So this transactional model is basically the argument that when children act, their parents react, and then children react back in this kind of mutually interlocking interactions over time that ultimately changes both partners. Okay. There are also some parent gender differences. So generally we find that fathers spend less time with their children than mothers, but it's important to note that fathers do make a significant contribution to children's social development above and beyond the contribution of mothers. So it's not to say that they're not important. One of the biggest differences is the way that fathers versus mothers play with their kids. So fathers tend to engage in more physically arousing play. Even with adolescents, fathers are more playful than mothers. They do more joking and teasing, where mothers tend to play more conventional games, interact with toys, and talk more. And so, of course, you have these parents with two different goals, and so we have to figure out how they're going to work together. So co-parenting is really how parents work together as a team. There's 3 different patterns that are going to have pretty big impacts on child's development. So cooperative co-parents are, a cohesive unit. They're child-centered. They're making decisions together. Hostile co-parents are kind of unkind or mean, or might even use the child to kind of manipulate the other. And then imbalanced involvement is when you have one parent that's really engaged and may even engage in gatekeeping, meaning they don't let the other parent kind of get involved and make decisions. Okay, so next we're going to move on to the sibling system. So most children spend more time interacting with their children than with their parents or anyone else. And interactions between siblings are a really important opportunity for children to learn positive and negative ways of interacting, and sometimes can be more emotionally intense than exchanges with other family members and friends. So one of the big questions about siblings is, are siblings affected by birth order, the order in which they were born? So there are some studies that find that the firstborn child tends to be more adult-oriented, helpful, and self-controlled. Later born kids are less fearful and anxious, and have more kind of self-confidence and poise. And only children are more high achievers and have more personal control and maturity. Now, we do sometimes find these differences, but it's worth noting that these effects are only modest in magnitude. There are many, many other things that are more predictive than birth order. But one of the things that can kind of affect this sibling dynamic is what happens when you start out with an only child and then you bring home a new sibling or a new baby. And there's a lot of evidence that parents have a substantial influence over how the older children react to a new sibling. So, for example, when a new baby is born, parents typically have less interaction with their older children, but sometimes this means that fathers become more involved with older children, and so that's a new opportunity for fathers to get involved. But we can see problems when parents do things like treating siblings differently, and so this creates kind of a non-shared experience, which over time potentially could create sibling rivalry. So sibling rivalry is competition, jealousy, and resentment between siblings, and this can begin when a new child is born. You see it a lot less if parents have a secure attachment to their firstborn and really pay attention to the older child and make an effort to maintain ties. And there's a lot of evidence that having a positive relationship with siblings can be important. So for example, this is looking at the association between friendship quality and sibling relationships and how much that affects the child's behavior. And basically what you can see if you look at this is all of the individuals who have a high quality sibling relationship, so the gray bars, all have relatively low aggression. Just like all of the individuals who have high quality friendships, which are the top 3 bars, have low aggressive behavior. So basically what this is saying is as long as individuals have either high quality friendships or a high quality sibling relationship, they have relatively low aggression. So a high quality sibling relationship can compensate for negative peer relationships or peer difficulties. Now, it's important to note that these sibling relationships aren't static. They change as kids grow older. So in adolescence, siblings often kind of become more alike and share more interests and are doing less like vying for their parents' attention. So especially as kids get to adolescence and emerging adulthood, we see sibling rivalry decreasing. Okay, the family system as a whole is also influenced by the greater environment. So for example, socioeconomic status. Now there's a number of different ways to define socioeconomic status, but in generally it includes the head of the households or the parents' education level, their income, and their occupational status. And often individuals from economically disadvantaged families have different problems or goals or values that they have to set to adapt to their environment. So on average, families who are economically disadvantaged stress more obedience and respect to authority. They tend to be more restrictive and authoritarian, and they do a lot less kind of reasoning and with their children, and they show less warmth and affection. And the argument is, if you think about individuals kind of growing up in poverty, what this does is kind of buffers them from the risk of being the victim of a crime or engaging with antisocial peers, because these parents kind of first priority is protecting their children from the environment. We can also kind of think of this as if we think about the kind of jobs that low socioeconomic status families are doing, some of these traits might lead them to be more successful in these kinds of jobs, right? So it's going to be beneficial if you're in a blue-collar job. You really want to please your supervisor and defer to authority, and so emphasizing obedience could be critical to this kind of success. There are also a lot of other stressors that can lead to family instability. So moving, changing residences, changing the caregiver, changing romantic partners, and living arrangements. All of these things can lead to family instability, which can lead to stress and changes in parenting. There's also kind of cultural patterns in the kinds of parenting that the parents engage in. So parents in traditional cultures tend to be less responsive and affectionate than parents in modern, technologically advanced cultures. We also see differences in individualistic versus collectivist cultures. So in individualistic cultures, they tend to value autonomy and emphasize competition, self-actualization, and open expression of emotion, whereas collectivist cultures tend to value interrelatedness and connectedness to the group. So they emphasize social harmony, cooperation, and empathy. And so this can lead to different parenting strategies. Okay, so next we're going to talk about some of the general patterns in parenting. So there's been a number of reasons why kind of the historically stereotypical nuclear family where mom stays at home and takes care of the kids and dad goes to work and they're married and they have their biological children is no longer really accurate. So one of the big changes is we're seeing more and more families where the mom is working there's so generally in these families in which both parents are working, both working mothers and their children complain that they have too little time to spend together. But in actuality, there's some interesting evidence shows that there's not much difference between working and non-working mothers. Because what happens is working mothers tend to reallocate their time and priorities. They're more likely to delegate the housework to others. and they kind of redefine their parenting role, so they really focus on their kids when they have the time to do so. We also see kind of a benefit in that fathers and families where both parents work tend to be more engaged and involved parents. Generally, we see maternal employment having, if anything, favorable outcomes for children in terms of self-esteem and social maturity. But one big thing that can be a problem is stress at work. So stress at work takes a toll on the children's parents' marriages, and stress from either parent. So for example, when fathers experience work stress, they tend to be less sensitive and engaged to their children. When mothers experience work stress, they may kind of withdraw from their children and their spouses. In contrast, really positive work experiences can actually enhance and improve parenting behaviors. Sometimes what we see is if both parents are working, sometimes children will be kind of self-care. These could be called latchkey kids. So these are kids who are caring for themselves after school with no supervision, so older kids. Generally, we see kind of inconsistent findings about these kids. So there's greater risk if these kids are low income. If they're somewhat monitored by a neighbor or something like that, it's less negative. Okay, another change we're seeing is later marriage and parenthood, and these are overall societal trends. So there's a number of reasons for this, right? There are improved employment and career opportunities, particularly for women, more flexible gender roles for both, a desire to have kind of completed education and become established before entering parenthood, and improved birth control, as well as improved reproductive technologies that make kind of delaying parenthood, if that's what you want, possible, and also having children at an older age possible when it wouldn't have been in the past. In terms of outcomes, what we see for older mothers, they tend to feel more responsible about parenting, they enjoy it more, and they express a lot more positive affect with their infants than younger mothers do, and they really spend more social time with their infants. Older fathers tend to have more flexibility and freedom to balance work and family. They're much more likely to be responsible for kind of daily care of their children, and are also tend to be more involved in the parental role. A couple other ways that we're seeing family life change or kind of alternative families, adoptive families. So research suggests that adopted children have a higher risk of psychological problems than non-adopted children. But there's substantial evidence that if adoption removes children from a negative environment, it certainly can be beneficial. A lot of this depends on the age at which the child is adopted, though. So earlier adoption generally appears to be better. Gay and lesbian families can be created in a couple different ways, right? So if a parent brings a child from a previous heterosexual relationship into a new homosexual relationship, or if a gay or lesbian couple who don't have kids from a previous relationship decide to become parents through adoption or donor insemination or surrogacy. And generally, there are concerns about the children of gay and lesbian parents being less healthy, or children being stigmatized by peers. There's really not a lot of support for any of these concerns. 90% of kids of gay and lesbian parents are heterosexual. There's no difference between that and the children of heterosexual couples. They're just as cognitively, emotionally, and morally mature. There's really no justification for denying parenthood based on sexuality. Another difference we're seeing is increasing number of single parent families. Generally, we find that these kids on average have kind of worse outcomes than two-parent families, children of two-parent families, but it's particularly negative if the mother was never married, versus if the mother was married and then later divorced. I think a lot of this comes from socioeconomic status, though. So single, never married moms tend to earn less and be less educated than divorced moms, and so that may drive some of the difficulties we see. Today we have, in terms of divorce rates, the rate is just under 4 divorces per 1,000 people. It's lower than it's been in 30 years, but it's still higher in the US than many other Western countries. And it's important to note that divorce is not just one event. It's a series of stressful experiences. We've got, reallocation of family resources, interactions, moves, new relationships, and so there's a lot that goes on with divorce. Also, it's not just post-divorce, but normally leading up to divorce, there's an increase in family conflict. Kids are responding with distress, sometimes aggression, sometimes kind of there's direct conflict with the kids, or sometimes it's indirect, but it leads kids to experience less security. Normally there's kind of a crisis period after divorce, a year or more, where you have kind of massive emotional disruption. Often the relationships between the children and the parents are upset. Parents are struggling with their own stuff, so they're less effective. And often this leads children to be anxious and angry and depressed, argumentative, things like that. We do see some kind of age differences. So in preschool and elementary school, often these kids show visible distress. Older kids might understand conflict and show some withdrawn or delinquent behavior. In adolescence, we see kids really understanding and engaging in delinquent acts. There are also differences based on the child's individual differences, right? So kids with difficult temperaments tend to have more immediate and long-term adjustment problems. They tend to be more kind of reactive to the negative parenting that may be exhibited as a result of the divorce. In terms of long-term outcomes, on average, children from divorced families have more behavioral and emotional problems than children of two-parent families. But kind of the positive side of this is that these differences between children in divorced and intact families are not huge. Long term, eventually, most kids show healthy psychological adjustment. 20 years after divorce, more show depressive symptoms and kind of lower life satisfaction. But stable single parent homes are associated with better adjustment compared to conflictual two-parent homes. So basically, although divorce can create difficulty, if the alternative is staying in a home where there's a lot of parental conflict, being in a stable single parent home is certainly preferable. Okay, so the effects of divorce may be explained by a child being raised in a single parent homes. As we mentioned, kind of immediately following divorce, children often experience a period of kind of poor parenting. They've lost their home, their lifestyle that they're accustomed to. Their outcomes often really depend also on the relationship with the non-residential parent, often the father. And there's a couple of different kind of custody arrangements. So most children are placed in the mother's custody. But research has also found that father custody can actually be advantageous sometimes for children's anxiety and depression and behavioral problems. We've got joint physical custody where parents make decisions together, and also kind of share custody, so the parents live with the kids half the time. Kids live with the parents half the time. In joint legal custody, both parents retain and share responsibility for decisions about the child's life, although normally the child resides with just one parent. And generally, these joint custody arrangements tend to be better than sole custody arrangements. So kids who have parents with these kinds of arrangements show fewer behavioral problems and have higher self-esteem and better family relationships. But it really works best when the conflicts between parents are minimal and the child doesn't feel caught in the middle. So if parents can kind of get it together enough to communicate, then these joint arrangements can work well. Finally, sometimes the outcome of divorce is remarriage. Often the average kind of time is 3 to 5 years after divorce. Parents are maybe remarrying. This graph shows that children who have experienced more marital transitions have greater risk for poor outcomes, because kind of each time a parent gets remarried, there is a significant disruption to life, right? Sometimes it can improve the financial situation, but it certainly takes longer to adjust to than divorce. So children of step families tend to have more emotional problems than children of intact families or even divorced families, but a lot depends on the age at which the remarriage occurs. So younger children tend to adjust more easily. Teenagers often have a more difficult time accepting their parents' remarriage. All right, and that is it.